On Thursday, President Biden signed 8 executive orders relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. I will read to you one of the executive orders as follows. Executive Order on a Sustainable Public Health Supply Chain. By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including the Defense Production Act of 1950, Sections 319 and 361 of the Public Health Service Act, Sections 306 and 307 of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, and Section 301 of Title III United States Code, it is hereby ordered as follows. Section 1. Purpose. The federal government must act urgently and effectively to combat the coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19 pandemic. To that end, this order directs immediate actions to secure supplies necessary for responding to the pandemic so that those supplies are available and remain available to the federal government and state, local, tribal, and territorial authorities, as well as to America's healthcare workers, health systems, and patients. These supplies are vital to the nation's ability to reopen its schools and economy as soon and safely as possible. Section 2. Immediate inventory of response supplies and identification of emergency needs. A. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the heads of appropriate executive departments and agencies in coordination with the COVID-19 Response Coordinator shall 1. Immediately review the availability of critical materials, treatment, and supplies needed to combat COVID-19 pandemic response supplies, including personal protective equipment, PPE, and the resources necessary to effectively produce and distribute tests and vaccines at scale. And 2. Assess, including by reviewing prior such assessments, whether United States industry can be reasonably expected to provide such supplies in a timely manner. B. Where a review and assessment described in Section 2A1 of this order identifies shortfalls in the provision of pandemic response supplies, the head of the relevant agency shall 1. Promptly revise its operational assumptions and planning factors being used to determine the scope and prioritization, acquisition, and distribution of such supplies, and 2. Take appropriate action using all available legal authorities, including the Defense Production Act, to fill those shortfalls as soon as practicable, by acquiring additional stockpiles, improving distribution systems, building market capacity, or expanding the industrial base. C. Upon completing the review and assessment described in Section 2A1 of this order, the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall provide to the President, through the COVID-19 Response Coordinator, a report on the status and inventory of the Strategic National Stockpile. D. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the heads of any other agencies relevant to inventorying pandemic response supplies shall, as soon as practicable, provide to the President, through the COVID-19 Response Coordinator, a report consisting of 1. An assessment of the need for and an inventory of current supplies of key pandemic response supplies. 2. An analysis of their agency's capacity to produce, provide, and distribute pandemic response supplies. 3. An assessment of their agency's procurement of pandemic response supplies on the availability of such supplies on the open market. 4. An account of all existing or ongoing agency actions, contracts, and investment agreements regarding pandemic response supplies. 5. A list of any gaps between the needs identified in Section 2A1 of this order and supply chain delivery, and recommendations on how to close such gaps. And 6. A compilation and summary of their agency's existing distribution and prioritization plans for pandemic response supplies, which shall include any assumptions or planning factors used to determine such needs and any recommendations for changes to such assumptions or factors. E. The COVID-19 Response Coordinator, in coordination with the heads of appropriate agencies, shall review the report described in Section 2D of this order and submit recommendations to the President that address 1. Whether additional use of the Defense Production Act by the President or agencies exercising delegated authority under the Act would be helpful, and 2. The extent to which liability risk, regulatory requirements, or other factors impede the development, production, and procurement of pandemic response supplies, and any actions that can be taken consistent with law to remove those impediments. F. The heads of agencies responsible for completing the requirements of this section, as appropriate and in coordination with the COVID-19 response coordinator, shall consult with state, local, tribal, and territorial authorities, as well as with other entities critical to assessing the availability of and need for pandemic response supplies. There are further sections to this executive order, but they go beyond the scope of this video. If you would like to read the rest of the order, you can do so, and the link is in the description below.